Welcome, my name is Martin Thompson from the ITAM Review, and I'm very pleased to have Danny Begg in this video today from Argos. Danny very kindly spoke at our conference in the UK in 2016, and I was chatting with Danny and he was discussing how he's got a lot more content that he didn't use at the conference, so we were keen to share that. So welcome Danny, welcome, and thank you for sharing your views here. How does what you're going to go through today differ from what you went through at the conference?
Okay, so I look at audit defense and negotiated compliance as 4 steps: pre-audit stuff that you need to do, your audit initiation, your audit defense, and then of course the negotiation. And at the conference this year I spoke mostly about negotiation and the things that you can do in order to get to the best compliance position. So in this I kind of wanted to go through all the other steps as well. I will also cover negotiation as well, but not probably in as much depth as I did in the conference.
Okay, perfect.
So I'll kick off without any further ado. So what's the main reason why I ended up speaking at the ITAM Review conference? Well, see, the thing is audits don't have any set routines. And I talked to a lot of IT asset managers in order to actually get more information on how they've actually tackled audits, how they've tackled vendors and everything else, to share knowledge and experience. You know, in the end, there's no prescribed way. So the more knowledge you have, the better toolkit you have in order to actually defend yourself in an audit. And the thing is vendors then thrive on that fear of being audited. Because you have that fear of being audited, you don't really want to go and discuss it with people. People think they should hide behind that audit, and that people don't want to know, you know, they'll hurt their company's image or something like that. I actually find that most people understand that you're going to be audited, that every company gets audited. So just because you're being audited by Adobe or you're being audited by Microsoft, well, I'm going to be audited by Adobe and Microsoft at some point if I haven't already. So actually, by talking about it, it takes away that fear that you're going to be audited. That once you realize that everyone else out there is being audited and every company expects it, then there's nothing to be afraid of anymore. And thus the vendors don't end up having that power over you. And then lastly is, you know, look, we're a value-driven profession. I spend all my time actually trying to show the value of SAM to my stakeholders, my CTO and CEO, and actually show them how much money I'm saving them at all times, what risk I'm taking away from them. So, you know, we need to actually show more of that to our stakeholders, and we need to show more of that to each other as well. So the reason why I want to speak on these types of topics is to get my knowledge over to people in a free way, and to hopefully have other people engage with me in order to share their information as well.
And that'll help us all. Kudos to you for doing that.
So what do I look at as my main steps? So I mentioned right at the very beginning, you've got 4 main steps. You've got your kind of, oh, apologies, we were at Argos. So we have turned over approximately 4 billion a year. We were recently acquired by Sainsbury's. And now we're classed and branded as Sainsbury's Argos. We spend about 100 million on IT with software renewals. They make about 30 million pounds of it, with the rest of it being projects and new business that we end up doing, as well as improvements to our infrastructure. We have about 400 vendors. On my latest count, actually, we're probably slowly getting towards about 500 vendors now. We've got the usual suspects. You know, the Adobes, the SAPs, the Oracles, the IBMs, Microsofts. But again, as with most of the rules here, we have 90% takes up around about 10% of our budget, and the other 10% takes up about 90% of our budget. So, and overall now we've got just over 4,000 products in licensed and open source. We have a large open source and development environment. And as I said, it's very complex. So like with most retailers, and in fact probably banks nowadays, is you put in a solution. It takes a lot of money to put in a solution, and since you only work on very small margins within the retail industry, it means that if you spend £1 million, you end up having to basically make another £100 million in sales to cover that £1 million that you spent on your new product. Since tools and projects and software can be so expensive, If I was to take something like AEM, which is probably around about £4 or £5 million worth of spend, I have to do £500,000 worth of business to cover that. So in that type of thing, it means that you went.
Sorry, Danny, just to interrupt, just to put this in context for those that are watching this outside the UK, I don't know how Argos and Sainsbury's feature in the top 10 UK retailers, but for those listening out or watching this outside the UK, they are both incredibly well-known brands with a presence in every high street in every town of the UK. I would have thought is very well-known names, aren't
they? Yeah, the household names. You know, the Argos catalogue has been going on now for about 50 years. So, yeah, very well known. And then, as I was saying, with most retail, you tend to have a very long tail. So you sweat your assets for basically forever. So we've got stuff here where, like I say, we've got COBOL from the 1980s. We've got AX 5.1, which is donkey's years old as well. We've got mainframes. We used to have old Solaris systems as well. And in fact, we do have a large Solaris estate within Sainsbury's. And so once you've made that massive investment, you end up having to keep it for as long as possible. Now, to be honest with you, people then think that Argos is kind of behind the times, but it isn't. You know, we do actually have bleeding edge technology where we use Dockers, containers, and you know, we spin up swarms on the cloud. So you know, we are really cutting edge along with the 30-year-old technology. So that's basically who we are. And as I said right at the very beginning when I was explaining what we do, what I'm doing today in comparison to what I did at the conference, is these 4 audit steps. So first one being pre-audit, and I class that as a number of steps, being mitigation, risk profiling of all your vendors, accepting what those risks are, planning and proactive defense. And then you have the audit initiation, where you get that first letter. You have your audit checklist and what things you're going to be doing. Then, of course, you have your defense. Now, the audit defense is actually probably one of the smaller pieces of it, but it's your strategies and your legal position around that. And then what I covered partly in the conference is your negotiation. So how you build up your team, what your strategies are, what the timelines and what your future relationship is. So your pre-audit, your negotiation, and your audit initiation, they're the bits that actually don't take that much time to end up doing. You know, they're not things that take forever, but your audit defense piece, right at that piece where you've got the strategies, where someone's giving you an audit letter and you end up doing something, that could take you 2 years, you know, PwC come in, ends up taking forever before you get to the end point. That's the bit that ends up taking all that time, gathering the information, but the other pieces are actually more important, but actually take shorter periods of time. So, first of all, we'll start off with pre-audit and mitigation. So, the way that I mitigate audits is by doing things such as creating policies. And what some of the policies that we've actually created, and these are just 3 of them here, is basically no vendor can audit us while they're in RFP. It's not that they can't, because you know they have the right to audit. It's just that if they do audit us during an RFP, we automatically exclude them from that new work. We have this basic understanding here that, you know, I'm not going to potentially give you money in an audit, even though I probably won't, you know, but I'm not going to have you audit us on that off chance while also paying you for new things as well. What we also have is, you know, if you go into an RFP, is you cannot audit us if you win the RFP. So what I don't like is to have someone say, like Oracle, come in, deliver a piece of work that's going to take 12 to 18 months, and then auditing goes, well, they deliver that. Because I've already given you access to our systems, you know, maybe they're looking around the system to see if there's an audit opportunity. And I want to mitigate that. I want to make sure that actually, you know, you're coming in to do a set piece of work, and during that time, I'm not having you audit me at the same time. So, if they do audit us, like I said, they have to go away from our RFP. And if they're in an audit, they don't get to even apply for any RFPs. So you're basically trying to play off the account team against the auditing team and seeing who wins. Normally, since they'll normally be quite a large project with most of these large vendors, is the project tends to win out over the audit. Other things what we tend to do is make vendor-specific policies or license constraints. So one of the things we do with the article is DR and changing the way that we actually do DR in order to restrict the amount of licenses. So what we actually say is we have a policy that says that we're only going to bring up a certain amount of Oracle systems, not all of our Oracle systems in a DR situation. So we're going to look at what we can actually manage our business on. What is our critical systems that means that our business continues running? Because Oracle have this lovely rule where if you have it in production and you have a DR system, it has to be licensed in the same way that the production system is. Well, that's okay. Then let's make sure that we reduce our DR system to as few as possible. And then we also use things such as test environments. So we make sure that we only use development type licenses, or we use mobility, such as with license tools. So this was more around things such as Microsoft. So if you've got your SA, and you've got the mobility around it, so you can spin things up and down. We ensure that we only get dev licenses for Microsoft and for those dev environments. So you know, there's a number of different ways that we actually make vendor-specific policies that help mitigate things that may potentially happen if we got into an audit. And then relationships. So a good relationship with your account manager should reduce your risk of audit. What I do is I have a quarterly meeting with all of my main vendors, IBM, Microsoft, Oracle, SAP, them all. And that's so that I can discuss with them the things that we're doing in the business, and so that they can discuss with me the things that they've heard is happening in the business. Because as we all know, Oracle and all the other vendors, Microsoft, IBM, etc., they all talk to everyone in the business that they can possibly think of. I mean, they're a sales team, so of course that's what they're going to do. They're going to try and speak to as many people as possible, the architects, to find out what's happening. And that sometimes means that as a SAM manager, you end up finding out about projects or things that the business is thinking of doing actually through the vendor and not through the business. It's not the right way, but we all know that this ends up happening. So the reason why I have these touch points is to get that information off them and to provide them with information on things that may potentially be of use to me as a SAM manager, as well as being used to the business.
So how
now, with that?
Sorry, Danny.
Helps.
Danny, I love this policy. How do you actually go about implementing that? So did you decide that with your CIO to say this is what we're going to do to reduce conflict, or how did you actually take
in which section?
The general policy creation, the no audit while RFP, for example. How do you actually go about executing that to make sure it happens?
So I wrote the policies before submitting them for sign-off, and I walked my CTO through them. The relationship I have with my CTO is that they've brought me in to do a particular job role, and that I'm the best qualified person to do that job. So they do allow me quite a bit of leeway in order to do the things what I think is best for the business. I do talk them through it, and I do have a lot of conversations with my stakeholders, such as my director for infrastructure, my chief technology officer, my CFO, in order to keep them abreast of things. But sensible policies where it doesn't harm the business, but it mitigates the risk to it, I don't see any reason why they don't get signed off immediately. And in fact, all of the policies that I've brought towards our IT leadership team have always been signed off.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense. Reducing the conflict. Yeah. Sorry, I interrupted your flow. So you're on vendor relationship.
Yeah, so like I said, with the good vendor relationships, if the account manager feels that there's business and conversations are going back and forth, then you can use them to mitigate an audit. So if you get an audit letter coming through, you've got a better chance of talking to your account manager to get rid of that audit. If you completely blank your vendors, then really what's in it for the account manager to go and jump in on your behalf on the auditing team? So those types of things can help. Admittedly, I always think about what you're sharing all the time, but I always think having a good relationship with them, and we have some very good relationships with some of our vendors, and that has helped on a number of occasions, so I do know that works.
See, I heard the other day that somebody a vendor phoned the service desk and said, we're your vendor, please can you run these scripts? And the admin guy on the service desk said, yeah, sure, ran the scripts and sent them all the data without asking anyone. That's worst case scenario, isn't it?
It is, but it does happen. I know, and I've been involved in a couple of those types of cases in my role as a SAM manager over the years, and it is more through communication and education. So the SAM team should be the team that goes out there and actually talks to people. That mitigates those types of mistakes. So as part of my business and part of the things that I do is, I do little 5-minute videos and little short notes and speaks that go out to every single person within the organization, whether they're in a shop or in the head office. It makes no difference to me. All about telling them about what to do if vendors approach you, what to do if people are asking you about certain information, and that if anyone asks you about software, just refer it back to the SAM team, and what we do to help the business so that people know what we do, what we deliver to the business, and how the business can deliver to us to better mitigate risk. So it's all about communication in that case.
Absolutely.
So after mitigation, we have risk profiling. So basically, in risk profiling, I look at each of the vendors to determine what is our risk from audit. So I talk to people like Martin from the ITAM Review. I talk to other people within this industry. In fact, I talk to everyone that I possibly can. I go to all the conferences and everything else because that is the best place to find out what vendors are active in the market. Who is auditing very highly at the moment? Who isn't auditing very highly at the moment? How are they targeting people? What's their strategy? How many people do other people know that have been audited? All of those types of things can help you determine what your risk is with a particular vendor. And it is all about trying to figure out what is your real risk rather than perceived risk. Would they really audit you? And the reason why I ask some of those types of questions is, if you have a particular vendor that you spend a fair amount of money with, but not a massive amount of money, but another part of the business does spend a lot of money with them, then the chances of them auditing you are actually lower because you've got a number of different eggs in the basket. So as a quick example, if you use people like Experian or a credit reference agency and part of your business is a bank and part of your business is in Argos' case, a catalogue, then in our catalogue business, we don't spend that much money with someone like Experian. We use them for postcode lookups. But on another side of the business, we spend millions of pounds with them on our banking side. So when they want to come in and audit us, or we think about how they're going to audit us, then the chances are they are not going to audit us on one particular part of the company, purely because they don't want to run the risk of losing business on the other parts of the company. So it's not just what your IT department is spending, but what actually is your business doing and how is your business interacting with each of those vendors, because there can be specific things that your business is doing that removes risk in other areas. And other things that you need to do is look at an audit defense strategy. I make one up for each of the vendors, because each of the vendors act in a different way. Admittedly, if you've got a vendor where you've only got 6 licenses from them, you may not want to do a specific audit defense strategy for them. But basically, look at those types of things, and they're the ones that aren't going to cause any risk to your business. But anything that does, then you do.
And just a tangible example of this, Danny, and this is not specific to Argos, this is with other conversations with ITAM Review readers. But for example, Micro Focus, who also own Attachmate, have got a bit of a stroppy reputation, and they've acquired or merged with some of the software from HP, and that's a perfect opportunity to go to your fellow SAM colleagues and say, well, have you had any letters from Micro Focus yet for your HP software? What have you seen? And just compare notes, because that's just intel, isn't it, to add to your strategy?
It is. So Micro Focus in particular, they bought out Serena, and now it's about 6 months down the line, and I know a number of different companies that are now getting letters from Serena.
Yeah.
But
you're not going to know that. You're not going to know that necessarily unless you start pounding the pavement and actually speaking to other software managers or colleagues in the industry.
Exactly. It is all about information and talking in that case. In regards to audits, I expect 2 to 3 audits per year, and I plan for 2 to 3 audits per year. If I get less, great. If I get more, okay, I can deal with it. It doesn't really bother me, but I do expect to get 2 to 3. One of them I expect to be mitigated more or less straight away, and this is normally because, you may have a piece of software, you've got 1,000 licenses, and you've only actually used 200 of them because you never actually implemented it fully, or it's a piece of software you're getting rid of slowly. So, you can more or less just give them the information and it disappears. So, another one tends to be little or no commercial or license implications. So, this again is another one where it ends up being mitigated pretty simply. It's normally a few different queries and that's it. But the way that you use that piece of software isn't really going to be big for you. It doesn't cost a lot to start off with. And then there's normally one large one. So, one of your IBMs, one of your Argos, one of your SAPs, one of your Microsofts. And that, to me, is the one that affects next year's budget. Now, the reason why I say next year's budget is I hear an awful lot from people saying is the reason why they're scared of audits is it's that unplanned expenditure. Well, I don't actually see an audit as an unplanned expenditure, because if someone was to come in and they were to say, oh, you owe us £1 million, well, that's fine. I'll pay you in next year's budget. Even if they came in today and my financial year finished yesterday, you can normally make an audit last long enough that you can plan for it in next year's budget. So I always think you can always budget for an audit. It just depends on how you end up playing the field in order to actually do it. And depending on your relationship with the vendor, you can actually be open and honest with them and actually say, I'm not paying you until my end of year. As long as they know they're going to get what it is that they need and you're going to fill your gap in, and actually they're normally okay with it. The other things is what else increases risk. So divestiture and M&A. So if you purchase a company, if you get rid of part of your company, they are always going to increase your risk factor, because most vendors see that as an opportunity. Lost sales opportunities. So if you've got a lot of quotes from them to say that you were going to purchase all of this software and then you decided to change direction because someone in the organization or the vendor may have reported that as an opportunity that they were going to win that year, and now that's all of a sudden gone away, they will normally use an audit in order to go and get that money back again. Lost RFPs. So you go through an RFP process, you said that IBM are going to win it, but Oracle end up winning it. Then that can often trigger an audit by IBM, because of course, again, it's something they predicted that they thought they were going to win and now haven't. The technical staff one is the one that kind of Martin brought up a minute or two ago, where they were calling up the help desk and the help desk ended up giving information out. Basically, internal misinformation is what I call that. That is where they are phoning your architects, they're phoning your technical staff, they're asking them questions on how they're using it, or your technical staff have a problem with a piece of software, and as part of that problem they ask them to run scripts and then forward them over the scripts. All of those types of things. The technical staff think they're doing the best job possible to fix a problem, but of course that doesn't mean that the information they're sharing has anything to do with fixing the problem and isn't actually just a information gathering exercise. And in regards to vendors and making sure that you talk to your vendors, if you have limited dialogue, and you haven't spoken to them for 2 years, then expect that they'll end up auditing you. If there's no money on the horizon, then there's no risk to them not to audit. So once you've profiled your risk, then of course you've got to accept it. So this is where you have to go back to the business and actually go, what is our total risk? So I always love this, is I end up speaking to a lot of people, and it's often shown as this scary high figure, whether that's by vendors, consultancies, managed service providers, or anyone. You end up turning around to you and they say to you is, oh yeah, with all of the software that you owe, this is like 12, 14 million pounds. And you go, wow, that's a huge amount of money. I'm going to go to my CFO and go and ask him for 12 to 14 million pounds in order to cover this risk off. But actually, what is my actual risk? So what's the maximum that any one vendor could bill me, and put some headroom into that for the unknown? You know, the things that you weren't able to get information on. So out of that 12 million, you may find that actually your largest one was £900,000. Put 10 to 20% on. So you're going back to the CFO for 1.1 million. So still scary for some, but not anywhere near as scary as the 12 million that they were originally saying. And then they go, well, you know, what's the risk, not just the monetary risk, but what's the risk to reputation? So I have a problem with that. I've put it in here because a lot of people talk about a risk to reputation. I actually think there's very little risk to reputation. People think that if their shareholders find out that they're being audited and that they may end up having to pay a few £1 million, that their share price will plummet. I don't see any evidence of that. Again, it's quite mature in that businesses have been audited for years, decades, by people like Oracle and IBM and everyone else. So why would your stakeholders or your shareholders know any different? I mean, the ones that own most of your shares end up being big business anyhow. Whereas the guy who owns 10 shares and lives down the road, what difference does it make to him? And if you think about your customers, well, most customers aren't affected if you owe SAP £1 million. They still come into your business and purchase whatever it is that they wanted.
I tend to agree with that to a degree. I think it was the US Navy story that came out recently, and it said that the US Navy used a certain application, they were unlicensed and they're due all this money, $1 million or whatever it was. And then it came out later that the US Navy said, actually, we'd agreed to use it this way with our account manager or something. And actually, in the end, do you think it's the vendor that looks an idiot because they've gone to press with effectively a public organisation. It's not, it's a public sector organisation, and it just shows how bad they treat their customers. So yeah, I tend to agree. It's usually shown as a big bad wolf, isn't it? It's the risk to reputation and the CIO going to prison and all this sort of thing. I think the times are changing, perhaps.
They are, and most businesses understand that people get audited. So I just don't see the risk anymore. People are scared and think their reputation will be damaged, and I see very little evidence of it ever. Even if they do make the mistake and end up settling for a undisclosed figure, it still has very little impact. You could look at the Mars case, for example, and they were quite open about it.
Yeah.
So.
And on the Mars point, they were, it wasn't like they weren't trying, which is all that matters. It wasn't negligence.
No, no business goes out there thinking, I know, I'll go and install 5,000 servers and not pay for any software. It just doesn't happen. Sometimes it's done with the best intentions that a service guy will end up putting the wrong patch on, or a service guy will go and increase a couple of CPUs on a server so that the web stays up. It's not done unintentionally. Intentionally. It's normally done unintentionally, which is why when the BCS come out and they say it's all piracy, I have massive issues with whatever they say, more or less.
Yeah.
So the last thing in risk acceptance is what risk will the business actually accept? So I always look at, when I've risk profiled everything, I work on the largest risk until it reaches the accepted risk level or below another risk level. So if I've got one at 1.5 million, one at 1.1 million, and the business says, look, we'll accept anything at 700,000, then what I'll do is I'll work on the one at 1.5 million, try and reduce that risk. When it gets down to a level playing field with the other vendor that's at £1 million, I'll work on both of them until I can get them both down to 700,000. That doesn't mean that I stop. It just means that once I've got it down to that, I can report to my board that no one is above our agreed risk acceptance level, and then I can start working on reducing that risk acceptance level. And of course, if we end up identifying a new risk, because of course this business is constantly changing, people change metrics, you find out that someone's done something silly and you catch it because of your discovery tools and stuff like that, then of course a new risk ends up being identified, and it's larger than your risk acceptance or the one that you're working on, then of course you move to that risk and continue working through it.
So how do you deal with the long tail? Because this is a great way of dealing with the larger stuff at the top end, but you mentioned a long tail of different vendors, which and you know everyone respects everyone's intellectual property and copyright and everything, but if there's just a few copies of cheap software somewhere low down the organization, you just haven't got the resource to get to it. How do you manage that internally?
So that's the last piece, which as in on here is I deal with low risk profile vendors. So anyone that I'm not spending a lot of money with, who I don't have an awful lot of installations of, to me is very low risk. Chances are those businesses don't have the resources to actually come out and audit me, but basically I deal with them at event. So I do most of my SAM as event driven. So I look at a renewal and then look at my ELP at renewals, or if I look to purchase a new piece of software, I'll look at the risks to the business at that point and ensure that we're either compliant or we know what we're going to be doing with that piece of software. So you deal with the long tail at any purchase renewal, any renewal and maintenance, or any audit event, or any other event that then targets that long tail. Because as we know, most of those guys are on our own in most organizations. If we do have a team, it tends to be very small. And if you try to actually deal with 4,000, 5,000 pieces of software at all times, or 500 vendors at all times, it's an impossible task. So work on the largest risk and deal with the low risk people as renewals and purchases come along.
And my argument has always been that any best practice and good discipline that you put in addressing the big vendors is going to ultimately benefit all the smaller vendors in your tail as well. Would you agree with that, or is that naive?
Oh, no, I would agree. So any policies and processes you put in place, they do end up affecting them. Maybe not in quite the same manner because it's not quite so targeted, but it does have an effect. So if you end up putting a policy in place that no one can purchase software without SAM's authorization, then the authorization isn't there to say no to them. The authorization is there so that you can capture those changes and events. And that way, if you're capturing those changes and events, then you're going to have a look at those smaller vendors because someone purchases one license for it. Well, okay, you've purchased one license. Let me go and check that the other 9 are compliant.
Yeah, and I find that I don't know if you agree with this, but a lot of the smaller vendors are a lot more pragmatic about things as well. So you can't use another piece of software unless you bought another license. You physically can't use it. So they're, I guess, a bit easier to manage.
Yeah, in some ways they're a little bit more old school, where you've got to go and put in a license key for each and every installation, which is what you used to do in the past. And of course, a lot of the vendors have moved away from that because it stops people from being agile in the way that they move their business. But of course, with that agility comes risk. So a lot of the smaller vendors aren't quite as agile, which does reduce your risk in those areas.
Yeah. Although you've seen Adobe move back to that model. But anyway, I digress. I interrupt in your flow. Please continue.
Well, that's okay. So next piece, of course, is audit planning. So with audit planning, it isn't about when the audit actually comes in, but what happens when it comes in. So we have vendor-specific plans and strategies. Yeah. What we did is we ended up putting in a 4-box grid. So we decided to say, okay, as a vendor, a legacy vendor, are they a new up-and-coming vendor? Are they a strategic vendor? You know, what type of vendor have we actually got here? So we put them into 4-box grid, emerging, strategic, tactical, and legacy. And based upon its position on the grid and its risk profile, determined on whether we were actually going to put a strategy around it. A lot of your legacy tends to have a strategy. They're the stuff that you've installed, but you haven't actually done anything with for donkey's years. You may not actually continue with that vendor, but they tend to have a big spend, and they tend to be ingrained in your business, so you're not going to be able to get them out very easily. Your strategic vendors tend to also be large spend, and tend to actually be working towards doing what your business needs. So new products that come out with those strategic vendors tend to be products that you're wanting to buy. So they end up having to need particular strategies. Your tactical vendors tend to be small spend to actually address a particular tactical need of your business. So they don't always need a specific plan or strategy. And your emerging vendors, well, they tend to be moving towards where your business is moving, but you haven't spent very much with them money at the moment. So you might not do a plan for them now, but you might want to do a plan for them in future as they move from an emerging vendor to a strategic vendor. After that, you go, well, who's going to be called upon to answer the audit? So these are just the people I call upon. So I always have, as soon as I get an audit letter come in, I talk to my legal team, my procurement team, my commercial team, which is my commercial managers for the vendor in question, and the vendor ops manager. So if you have a particular vendor manager or your operations, the people who are actually running that piece of software, I include them. They're the people I will go to at all times in order to answer any questions. And whenever I actually speak to any of those vendors, I always have those letters going through the legal department. And the reason why is any letter that goes through the legal department, they have to accept as true because it comes from a legal professional. And any letter that does come through the legal department are vetted and agreed to. And in the end, well, they're the ones who would have to defend you. So if you can convince your legal team and your legal team are happy, then you've won half your battle to start off with. So what I do is I then mark out what their roles and responsibilities are within the audit. So the legal team, they'll do all the documentation, they'll go through the contracts with me, we'll have weekly calls or weekly meetings. Procurement, they'll end up getting me all the data of what we've purchased, where the contracts sit, so that we can sort through and then ensure. And don't forget, this is stuff that you do every day anyhow, but on that audit, when that audit starts to come through, or the part of the plan is you want these people to go and get you that information so you can look through it a second time. Because don't forget, you're not looking at every document from Oracle on a daily basis. Your commercial team, needing to know what the responsibilities are for each of the vendors. So you'll say, oh, John owns these 3 vendors, Peter owns those 2, Sarah owns those 6. Knowing which ones are there, and of course, mapping out who actually runs the stuff. As part of your audit planning, you should determine when you're going to meet and how you're going to meet and what's going to change that frequency. So at the beginning, you're going to go weekly, and then when you get into this large part where they start asking for information and PwC are going to be on site for the next 3 years, do you change it to a monthly meeting or do you keep it a weekly? And then what's going to change that? So if all of a sudden you get a letter where it looks a little bit like they may have found some information on some non-compliance, do you change it to a daily meeting so that you actually talk a lot with your legal team as you get more information? What's going to actually happen? Where's your escalation path? So basically, who's accountable? We're responsible for getting all the information and responding back to the audit, but who's accountable for each of those vendors? Now, for us, it tends to be the vendor manager that tends to be more accountable. But of course, my manager as well is also accountable. He's accountable for me and what I do, so he's accountable for the auditing as well and making decisions on that. Also, who's going to pay? So, who's accountable in that respect if there was anything to pay? Or do you end up going straight to your CFO? And then you're also mapping out things such as your financial year ends of each of the vendors. So as part of that audit plan for each of these vendors, mark out when's their end of year. That might not match your end of year, but actually knowing when that end of year is, it allows you to actually go, right, okay, so if we want to meet a HP audit, I need to get my negotiations finished for October when they're most likely to give me the best deal possible, because that's their end of year. So that allows you to then work out what strategies you will use to get to that date. And then, of course, communication plan.
Sorry to interrupt, but you could go to a number of those vendors on that page, and I don't know what the statistics are, but it's something like 40% plus of their revenue will come in the last week for the year or something. It's really stacked up, isn't it?
It is. I mean, I think Oracle last time was over 80 or 90% of their revenue comes in the last 5 days of their business year.
Yeah, it's just crazy.
And the same SAP. So it is really critical that you hit them for that end of year, because that is when they will do every deal possible in order to get it. So the last thing is your communication plan. I think I've mentioned this on a couple of slides, and we've spoken about this as well, Martin, during this conversation here. is loose lips cost liars. They really do. You know, ensure that as soon as you get that audit coming through, the audit plan initiates a communications plan that shuts down all communications from everyone else in the business to that vendor, and that all communication only comes through the audit team, the people who are going to respond to it. So once you've done your audit planning, then of course you've got your proactive audit defense. So this may seem like a lot of stuff, but actually each of these is 1 or 2 page documents, you know, with your risk profiling, your acceptance, what mitigation you're doing, you know, your policies are only a couple of pages. So these are all short, easy things to do, but quite important. Your proactive audit defense is kind of your typical audit defense. What's your software strategy? How are you going to onboard different vendors? Now, when I say onboarding, this is the stuff such as like you know, ELPs and stuff like that, which we also hear an awful lot about. So do you do it by risk profile? So this is where I was saying before about emerging, strategic, tactical, and legacy vendors. Yeah, so I do with all of my vendors. I put them into each of those boxes. I map it out depending on cost and the business direction, and then that allows me to actually figure out what I want to do with them. Do you onboard all your vendors, or especially if you've got a very long tail, consolidating them? You know, what actually are you going to be doing with your software? And find out from your CTO and your development teams what they're going to develop and get rid of. You know, find out whether you're going to get rid of some software, but you're actually going to increase your spend with other software. And your emerging, strategic, and tactical will help with that, because anyone in the emerging part of the 4-box grid is probably going to move to strategic. So they're the ones that actually, you know, you're probably going to move into, and strategic stuff may end up moving into legacy. So that's how your software is going to move over time. So ELP generation. So I love ELPs and I hate them. So your effective license position gives you a point in time. It doesn't actually tell you anything to do with it. So I would say with an ELP is just accept the gaps. Sometimes there's nothing you can do with it. You may have a gap where you owe 10 licenses. Well, there's nothing you can do with that. You know, some people may say purchase licenses. Well, if you don't have any budget, that's hard. That doesn't mean you can't plan to purchase it in the new financial year. But likewise, you could have with the same vendor where you've got 200 licenses too many in another piece of software. So you can then go to the vendor and go, can I swap some of those 200 licenses for the time I'm short of? You know, there's lots of different things you can do, but sometimes you just have to accept those gaps. Plan of risk mitigation and your roadmap maturity. So how are you actually going to improve those ELPs? Yeah, which vendors are you going to do next? And then, of course, your audit defense is managing that risk by going to these conferences, speaking to people like Martin, looking at websites, finding out what things are going to change, and also talking to your business. Honest risk appetite changes throughout the year. So throughout the year, the business is doing well, and you're 8 points up from where you were last year, and your year-on-year this week is doing brilliantly. And then all of a sudden, the business starts to take a bit of a nosedive, and you go, okay, now we're not doing so as well as we were last year. You may find that actually your risk acceptance changes at that point. They were happy with 700,000, now they're happy with 200,000 because they're now not making as much money. Whereas actually, if their business is growing and growing, they may actually increase your risk acceptance because they go, well, actually, we're okay with money at the moment. I prefer to be concentrating on what my business is doing rather than having to worry about reducing all my risk in the background. So it's about keeping all of those up to date.
Could I just add something to your grid? So you've got tactical on the bottom left. I think what you could also call that is commodity. So you might be spending and then Adobe is a classic one for this. You might be spending a big amount with Adobe, but actually it's for a commodity item that could be swapped for something else. Therefore, it's not strategic. It's actually is a tactical thing. I think that should be part of people's diligence on this as well.
Yeah. However you want to move that grid, it's about mapping your vendors to it in order so that you can understand how things are moving, and having those constant conversations with your vendor managers and the business to see how those people are moving on. So considering all the purchases are done for you, you'll be able to map the cost and be able to move their little dot across the chart until eventually they kind of moved into a strategic
And
box. Or
this is really why a lot of the vendors are doing audits, is because not only do they want revenue, but they're desperate to be strategic, aren't they? They want to know what you're doing. They want to know what you're developing, where you're moving. They want to put the fingers in all the pies to be strategic at any cost. Um, so they,
well, and the least they want to be is legacy, although they're quite happy with legacy because that's just a long-term 30 years of you paying the maintenance without
yeah.
them having to actually put any hand in their pocket. You're classed as pure profit at that point. So that's all the areas in regards to pre-audit. They're all your things such as your mitigation, risk profiling, your risk acceptance, your planning, and your proactive defense. Your proactive defense is probably the bit that you spend most of your time on with your ERPs. The others, all extremely important, but of course they're all single-page documents, two-page documents that just allow you to have the information to hand whenever an event ends up happening to you. After that, of course, you're waiting for that event to happen. So the audit initiation. So, and that audit initiation is who ends up starting it. So this could be a self-audit or you starting the audit. So this is one of the things I've spoken to a number of people on, is most of the time people wait for an audit to happen to them. Well, actually, if you're in a really good position, you actually initiating an audit could actually be a benefit to you. And the reason why it could be a benefit to you is if actually you're in a good position, you're probably over licensed and everything else, you're kicking off an audit, sending them that information, initiates the audit clause within your contract, the vendor agrees with that, is quite happy, says thank you very much. On the theory, actually, considering they only do one audit per year, you may have actually stopped an audit event happening for a year, which allows you time to actually go and concentrate on other vendors. So self-audit is where I talk about a vendor goes to audit you and you turn around and you say, actually, I'll do an audit, or I'm already in an audit internally and I'll send you the results. So these are just little bits of tactics on regards to initiating an audit, on stopping the audit coming from the vendor side. If it comes from the vendor side, it just tends to be a bit more painful. When you ask about who carries out the audit, most of the time they'll try and get a third party such as PwC, KPMG, E&Y, someone like that to come in and actually do the audit. There are other third audit parties out there, but normally they'll try and use one of them. Now, under most of the clauses, the vendor, in fact, in all the clauses I've seen, the vendor has the right to audit, not a third party, even though it does in the contract say is they may use a third party to do that audit. Well, they may use a third party to do that audit. That doesn't mean you have to agree to that third party. So you can quite happily turn around and say, no, Mr. Vendor, you have the right to audit, and I'll let you audit, and thus I'm meeting my contractual obligation, but I'm not allowing the third party on site.
I think self-declaration that's the ultimate sign of maturity. I think is to say, look, we've got our ship in order. Here's our self-declaration, and then it sort of takes the wind out of the sails of any aggressiveness, doesn't it? To say, look, well, these guys have clearly got their stuff together, and we'll go and find somebody else who's a bit more immature.
It is, but I actually think throughout the whole maturity curve, that can be done. So because you always end up starting somewhere. So if you end up starting on a vendor and you find out you're in a good position, you can quickly go and do your audits, get them out of the way, and don't have to worry about them for a year while you concentrate on someone else where you may have an issue or a problem, or it's just more problematic getting the information. That could have been within 6 months of you starting as a SAM manager. Admittedly, as you get more and more mature, then of course this becomes a lot easier and you can initiate more of these. But as you go through each of the vendors, whether you're able to initiate a self-audit or whether you wait for an audit to come in is a decision that's taken at the time as you go through. Because of course you can't tackle them all at once. So, and you'll find actually with a lot of your long tail, they're the ones that they may be large enough that you want to actually self-audit and send the stuff in yourself. Because their company is large enough, or they're too small that you just don't bother with anything. But with those ones, if you've only got a small amount of spend, then the chances are you're in a very good position to do a self-audit. When the audit starts, of course, you have to find out where your contract is. Where's your entitlement? What are your legal obligations? So this is where I jump in with the legal team and I go through with the legal team every single line within the contract to actually find out what is my obligation to you, Mr. Vendor. Because the first thing the vendor does is ask you for every single piece of information on your estate. Typical one is they go, oh, I want an extract from your AD. Oh, strictly, do you need to give them an extract from your AD? Yeah, you've purchased 50 licenses. They're on 50 machines, and you've told them what those machines are. Really, do you need to tell them about every other machine on your estate? I question that an awful lot. And when you look at the legal obligations, most of the time, the answer is no. Review contracts and prior audits. Get your line in the sand. Basically, we've had an audit before. That's your kicking off point. You use that as your baseline. Whatever you then done after that point, and that identifies any exclusions. So you may have had an exclusion in a prior audit that you can reuse again. Know your ERP. So, like I've put here, an ERP is like Swiss cheese. You don't know you don't know how many holes you've got. Those holes may be easy to fill, they may be hard to fill, and it may not be worth filling in those holes. And you also have a lot of these conversations where people say, oh yeah, but I need to know everything. Well, you do, but if getting that information means that you have to go to your managed service provider, initiate a project, pay for that project, and then pay for them to deliver that every quarter from that point going forward, and then you find there's another hole with that vendor, and you'd have to do that again, you may find that to fill the hole in, it may cost you £50,000. You may find that your gap to buy the license is £4,000. So actually, is it worth just purchasing a license and not bothering filling in the hole?
And the approach of a modern SAM managed service provider is actually to give you a portal to access your own data, so that if you're in an emergency, you can get to that data quickly.
Yeah, so things such as who can get the required data for you, and can you get the data? So I find that managed service providers are really slow, and they cost money. So when I say really slow, I mean some of them are glacial sometimes in getting the information for a SAM team, because there's always something better for them to do. There's always someone else that wants something that's going to give them money for it. So trying to get your SAM information is just painful. And then, of course, knowing what the software is used for and why it's used. Don't forget, you can have thousands of products. You're not going to know them all. You know, people come to us and think that we know everything about software and everything about licenses. We don't. We just have more information than anyone else, and we tend to have the experience and the knowledge that if one particular metric works for that particular vendor, chances are it works the same for another one. We also know where the problems and the indications tend to know. We also know where the black holes are. So all of that knowledge ends up bringing it up, but you can't know every single product and what it does. So actually going out there, talking to the business and finding out what it is and what it does enables you to be in a lot better state for when that audit letter comes in. Once you've got the audit letter, of course, you've got your audit checklist. What is it that you're going to do? Now, the ITAM review have a really good piece on this. And so I would suggest anyone that really wants to find out what their checklist should go on there. I've forgotten who it's written by. Martin, maybe you have that to hand. But theirs is great. So first of all is negotiating the audit of the scope of the audit. So what's your non-negotiables? What's your negotiables? What's your wish list? And it is extremely important. Don't just think that they've sent you an audit letter, that's it. They can do what they like from that point. No. First thing you should be doing is sitting down, having a meeting with them, and defining exactly what they're auditing, exactly what it is that they're going to be doing, the information they request, and what stuff you're not going to allow them to do. There may be stuff that you can't take offline, or stuff that you can't get to because of the way it works within your business. So the non-negotiable there is you will declare it, and you'll have it declared and signed off by your legal team. You know, but we're not going to run any scripts on those machines. So those types of things need to be panned out along with the vendor, so that you know. A lot of the time the vendor just says everything. Oh, we're going to audit you on everything. Well, no, actually, I haven't purchased everything from you. So actually tell me the software, exactly what software you are going to audit us on, and the versions you're going to audit us on. So otherwise, everything, when you talk about Oracle and that, there's tens of thousands of products. You're just not going to have the time in the world to do that. So they need to actually specify. In that checklist, you want to find out about geography, your legal entities, what things are they actually going to do, devices types, OSs. We're going to do is where can they work, what data is you're going to allow them to have, in what format. Is it going to be PDF? Is it going to be Excel? Or are you actually going to print it out for them and give it to them and allow them to then read it and make notes from it? And then what type of non-audit clause are you going to agree at the end of the audit? So, they may say they'll only do one audit per year unless it's deemed necessary. Well, at the end of the audit, you may say, well, actually, no, we're going to do this audit, and we complete it. I don't want an audit done for at least 2 years, minimum 2 years. Whether you can get the whole 2 years, well, that's a point of negotiation, isn't it? But all of these things, and there's more that you should be looking at, is create your checklist and ensure that in that meeting you cover each of these areas off, so that you know exactly what you're being audited on, how you're being audited, how that information is going to change between you both, and what's going to happen. From that point, of course, you've got your strategy and your legal positioning. So in this area, I kind of think about, what do I need to do legally? So this is where I said in the contract, find out what you need to do. The legal team will define your minimum commitment of data and its format. So when they send you through, say, like the OSW from Oracle, what fields in that OSW do you actually need to legally fill in? Well, you don't need to put in the computer name. You can put in any name into there, because that's private data for you. You don't need to put an IP address in. There's lots of data there that is easy to give to people, but actually isn't needed in order for them to actually confirm whether you're licensed or not. And some of the fields I do feel from a lot of vendors are just there just because if we know more about your business and the way your organization works, we may be able to target you for future sales, or we may find out that you're doing something that we didn't realize you were doing. Or maybe we'll find out at a different vendor and we'll tell them.
Sending IP addresses and computer names to a third party is never a good idea anyway, is it? Especially when they're likely to be using a third party. And where is it they do their processing, Oracle? They do it in Eastern Europe. Romania, thank you. So they're pinging it across to Romania and back. Meanwhile, what security is around, and I'm not being oversensitive here, that's a route into your business, isn't it? IP address and computer name, and away you go.
Yeah, I mean, they're the obvious ones not to give over, but there's lots. If it is processor, well, you can give them the processor and how many you've got, but you don't need to tell them exactly what that PC is doing or what that server's doing. They do have a column that says, what does their server do? Well, that's none of your business, Oracle, unless it runs an Oracle application. Do you know what I mean? Unless it's running something that you're auditing me on, actually, I don't need to tell you what it's doing. Yeah. So that's information they just don't need to know. Verify all the legal questions that they're asking. Find out what your tactical maneuvering is in order to ensure contract compliance. Look at your response strategies. So this is where I said is if their end of year is October of next year and you've just been audited today, that's a year that you're going to have to get them to. Now, you may have all the information to hand, which is great. Chances are you don't, so you end up having to spend some time anyhow. But is it going to take you 12 months? Well, in some audits it does, and some audits it takes longer. Normally the biggest reason why it takes longer is because the scope hasn't been set strongly enough. It's not been constrained enough, so when an auditor finds a compliance gap somewhere, they end up looking for more stuff. And because the scope hasn't been defined and it's just classed as everything, then of course they can then just search around the network trying to find other areas where you may have made a mistake. So if you need to go and get them for that year, there are things such as like printing the results on paper. Have them work on paper formats to slow the audit down. I've not yet come across a contract where it actually says that you need to actually send it in an electronic format to them to a certain email address or any other thing. So if it is, I need to go and run a script, well, I'll give you the output on that script on paper, and then you can analyze it. Yeah, I don't need to give it you in any other format. So, yeah, making the audit difficult, but within the constraints of the contract. So the reason why I say that, maybe a little bit controversially, is the reason why I ask my legal team so much is I will work within the constraints of the contract. The contract says I must do this, so I will only do those types of things. Now, that might make the audit difficult, but I'm not there to make the audit easy for them. That's not my job. My job is to make it difficult, is to give them the information that they require, that they legally require. I'm not here to make PwC's job easier so they can get more money or anything else. So if it ends up taking them so much time and so much effort, maybe they just won't bother with the audit and they'll cancel it, or maybe they'll change it to a self-declaration. So I declare what I've actually used. Now, I don't mind doing a self-declaration because at the end of it, I'll tell you exactly what we're using and where we're using it and how we're using it. And you should respect that and agree to it and believe it. So delaying the conclusion to the audit to the end of year. And that's for yourself or the vendor. So you may find that actually, do you know what? We've made a mistake. That's fine. No problem with that. Everyone makes mistakes. And we think we owe you £200,000. Well, I can't pay you till March, so I'm going to delay this long enough till March. Your end of year is June, so I'll get into next year's budget and we'll renegotiate at that point. So sometimes it's useful for you and sometimes it's useful for them. So theirs may be June and actually your end of year is not till August. So they want it in before June. You may be able to negotiate with them to actually say, okay, look, we will pay you in August once our new financial year comes, but we'll agree to the outcome by June so that you can recognize it within your financial year. So this is all about getting the best negotiation position. And that can work on both sides. And ensure that communications data, yet again, is sent through the nominated person or group. This is about ensuring that you keep and lock down your communications to the vendors, because otherwise it just causes you more pain when people are talking cross purposes, or when people are given information actually they don't have any need to give, or people give the wrong information. And I've had that on a number of occasions where people have assumed we've used it in a particular way, have said something to the vendor, and the vendor ends up spending weeks tracking down this assumption that's completely and utterly wrong, with you getting more frustrated all the time trying to stop and block it because it has no relevance and you're just going down a rabbit hole that leads to nowhere. So again, it's so important to ensure that you are in control. And when I say you are in control, you, not the vendor. So once you've got all of these things happening and all of these things are going on, then of course, I said you've got your plan for your vendor, for your audit. You'd have to then determine what your team structure is for that audit. So you already had the types of people that would come, but what additional people may be required? So what additional resources are you going to have for the architect come? You didn't have them in your plan, but now that you're getting more detail, do you actually come and become part of the auditing team, or audit response team? What are your team for each of the people in the roles, and what are the negotiation strengths? So this is all now starting to get down to negotiation. So you may find that in your team you have a certain type of negotiating style, and actually you need to get other people from other styles. So or some people go to decision making. Well, sometimes you need to get a decision maker in, even if they're not doing any of the actual negotiation. So that means you're getting your CFO in the room, even if they don't do any of the negotiation. They're just there so that at the end they understand the decision being made, and they can actually turn around and say, yeah, okay, I will agree to that amount of money. What your negotiation styles are you going to use? What you're for and against? So these are the four kind of styles that people use. There's different names for them. I've used these particular ones. There's the bully, which is competing, the negotiator, collaborative, politician, who kind of avoids everything. You can understand why it's called the politician, and the doormat, which is accommodating. Now you might think, well, why would anyone be a doormat? Actually, it's a useful strategy at times, dependent upon what that vendor is doing. So one of the things I always say is, do you have someone from each negotiation style involved? Now, my negotiation style is, I'm the 600-pound gorilla. I'd never thought I was, but every time I've gone into conversations and audits and negotiations, the procurement team and the commercial management team have basically said that I've tried to beat people over the head. So in this particular style, then I'm classed as a bully and a competing negotiator. So I'm looking for a win-lose situation where I'm the winner at all times. And there's nothing wrong with that. That works sometimes and in certain scenarios. The negotiator, people think that will always work because it's all about getting a win-win. It is about getting a win-win, but the negotiator is there quite often used in conjunction with the bully. So the bully will, you're kind of saying good cop, bad cop type scenario there. The politician is there to kind of slow negotiations down sometimes, to kind of just avoid giving anything away whatsoever, to see what cards the other people have on the table. And the doormat, or the accommodating type negotiator, and that type of style is when actually you need to give the vendor stuff in order so that you can retain your relationship. So if this is one of your emerging vendors and you've made the mistake and you want to be using them in a more strategic manner, then actually accommodating them in certain areas will allow you to actually get a better resolution at the end, because it may mean that actually you accommodate them and then you can negotiate all the software that you were going to purchase anyhow, but they didn't know about. And that gets you a better position for that new software. So you can end up winning by actually being accommodating. You then have to look at what type of strategies you're going to use. Like I said, who will be involved from both the vendor and your company for each of the negotiating meetings, and who will actually do the negotiation. So this is where you actually find out in your first meeting with the vendor, you find out what type of styles they're going to be bringing to their meetings, which people are the bully, which people are the negotiators, which ones are the doormats, etc. So that when you find out who is actively negotiating in that particular meeting, you can have your opposite negotiating on your behalf. So that enables you then to keep more in control. You also have to take into account their cultural perspective. Honestly, there's a big difference between the way that people negotiate in the UK. People could say this, the ultimate gentleman. We don't get upset or anything else, and that's completely different to how some other countries negotiate. Look at the APAC countries. There's a lot of different styles and cultural ways, especially in places like Japan, in the way that people act. Give you a good story, Israel. So the Israelis, they have a very unique style of negotiating. I remember once being in a meeting with them where they came into the meeting. I had no signal. I was in the middle of a building somewhere, kind of in some far-off room. And they came in, they put an envelope on the table, and they said, "That's what we're prepared to pay." And then they walked out of the room and locked the room. And they said, "We'll see you in an hour." And they went away. I couldn't phone anyone, couldn't phone my boss, looked at the money on the table. And basically, they came in after an hour and said, "Is that what you agreed to?" And that was their negotiating style, is they basically place the figure on the table and tell you to make a decision. The reason why they put you in a room that you can't get communication out of is if you're not able to negotiate and you're not able to make a decision, then you were the wrong person to be in the room. And that's an important lesson to learn, is in your negotiations, ensure you take the right people that can make a decision, and ensure that they can also make the decision on their side. There is no point in having a meeting with a vendor if the people come in and can't make a decision. So then you have to look at, the concession trading, your auctioning, your win-win scenario setting, bad cop, worst cop, that type of thing. In regards to concession strategies, is list your goals and your negotiation styles required for each of those goals. So some of those goals will require you to be the £600 gorilla, where you will beat them over the head and say, no matter what, this is what I want and this is what I'm going to get. Some of them are going to be ones that you will be more your accommodating, or more of your doormat type style, where you will actually give them away in order so that you can get what the £600 gorilla wants. So it's all about trying to figure out which ones will work for which negotiating styles and which ones you actually want. Like I said, make the meetings appropriate, with appropriate authority to make the decisions. Have your non-negotiables agreed right at the very beginning before you even start a meeting, because those non-negotiables, and that's from both sides, because there's no point in arguing if you're not prepared to, or even negotiating if there's something you will not move on. And most of the time, non-negotiables from both sides tend to be reasonable. There's no point in having something that you know they will never ever agree to as a non-negotiable, because you don't have a negotiation strategy at that point. And like I said, assess the negotiating styles and determine your defense against each of those styles. So as part of having your non-negotiables agreed, then of course you've got to have your concession strategy agreed as well. So first of all, you've got to clarify the vendor's goals. What is it that they want to get out of this? Now, it's always money, we know that, but actually trying to assess how much money that is going to be. Because don't forget, quite often they come and they say, oh, we want 45 million. And then the next time they come and they say it's 15 million. Then it's 3.9, then it's 1.5, and actually you find out that actually they want 650,000. So that's their main goal. I mean, one of their other main goals is to keep you as a customer. So they don't want to be too aggressive, not unless they think that there is no point in being in your business any longer, and that their long-term strategy is, or your long-term strategy is, not to have them as a vendor, at which point they'll try and go for the throat because they've got nothing else to lose. Have clarity on your goals. What do you want to get out of it? Now, we all know that's going to be paying as little as possible, but is paying as little as possible potentially purchasing a piece of software? So if it meant that you purchased a piece of software that you probably were going to use anyhow, and you have to purchase it early, and that gets rid of the audit because you've purchased something, that could well work within your goals. Have a sequence of what goals you're going to trade and exchange for both parties. Of course, you're not going to know exactly what theirs is, but you can make an assumption. If you've listed out what you think all their goals are and what things they're going to be prepared to trade for, then it gives you a little bit of insight. In each of those meetings, you can refine that, but it gives you a little bit of insight of what's actually going to be happening. Do a SWOT analysis of those goals. Map it against the negotiation styles. And then the last thing is work out what your BATNA is, your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. Basically, what's going to happen if it fails? If you cannot negotiate what you need, if you cannot come to an agreement, what's going to happen? And then basically, by figuring out what is your least point, what is your bottom position, if you can't get to at least your best alternative negotiated agreement, then there's no point in continuing on negotiations. There's no point in having them there for 2 hours if you can't even get to your BATNA. If they're in there 10 minutes and you've not gone to that point, then just terminate the negotiation and walk away from the table. Now that works on both sides. That works if you're purchasing something or in an audit. And you may think, well, you don't have as much power in an audit. No, you don't. But in the end, well, they're going to have to go and take you to court at that point, and it's going to be painful for them, it's going to be painful for you. By the time they've done it all, you may have gotten off their solution anyhow. So actually, walking away and telling them is actually we're walking away because you're not even giving us anything that actually we want to negotiate on, allows them to go back to the directors and actually say, yeah, we didn't even get to their BATNA, so we're going to have to change something if we want to continue a relationship, or if we want to actually do this without going through legal proceedings. And going through legal proceedings isn't always the worst thing that can happen. Lastly, you want to figure out what your timeline is, how this is going to actually be done. Is there a deadline to be reached? Well, yeah, your end of year or their end of year, due to the strategies that you've decided to take on and the things that you're going to follow. Set out clear timelines and meetings. So the reason why I say that is if you actually say to them, there's going to be 6 negotiation meetings, these are the dates that are going to happen, this is the time period of each of those meetings, these are the people that are going to attend them, then actually having those clear timelines and meetings keep those negotiations from faltering. Because as you progress through those 6 meetings, if you said, I'm not going to extend those 6, it's only going to be 6, then actually it puts pressure on both sides to get to a negotiated position at that point. What it also does is it allows the vendor to know and agree to pre-planned meetings, and it ensures that they can make decisions, and they can actually tell their managers is we will have a negotiated position on this date because that's what we've all agreed to. Admittedly, if you get to your BATNA, that's your walk away point, but then he's able to go back and say we didn't get to a negotiated position. But if everything goes properly, that is your negotiated date. He's able to tell his managers. Everyone then feels much more comfortable, and there's I always think there's that possibility that they end up being a bit more flexible. Not at the beginning, but as you get to that final meeting, they tend to be a little bit more flexible because they've told their managers it will be concluded on that date. And then the contracts and baselines should have an agreed date of completion. Clear commitment helps both sides of the party. The last part of the negotiation is basically what's going to happen with the relationship after it. So while I'm in negotiation, while I am in an audit, I hate the vendor as much as I possibly can. Really, they are not my friend. I don't really like them or anything else. But also I'm a pragmatist. In the end one, I have a business to run. Not me, myself personally, but also as a business. We have a business to run. And thus that may mean that we end up having to keep on with that particular vendor. So what is it you want to do? Some of the vendors you may not want to keep a positive relationship with. Some of them you may do. So how can you keep it positive once you've completed it? Because there's going to be a bit of animosity on both sides. I don't think I'm an emotional person too much. But we all know that vendors and in these types of situations or scenarios, it can get under your skin. So there can be some personal pain there. So how are you going to keep that positive going forward? One of the things is, again, one of the very first slides I said is about keeping your meetings. You know, I have quarterly meetings, or quarterly or every 6 months, depending on the vendor, and reduce that risk of future audit. So keep that relationship going. Admittedly, if you don't want to have a relationship with them, then actually just kill it all off. That's perfectly fine as well. And actually, how did that end up affecting your 4-box grid? So in those meetings, have it related to that 4-box grid. You may say it's actually, you were an emerging vendor, you audited us, actually figured out that I can't work with you. So actually you're going to move into tactical, and we'll keep on using you for the one thing that you fixed and got better, but we don't intend to actually spend any more money with you. So you're now gone into a tactical box. But actually, yeah, actually that wasn't too painful. We want to keep on working together. So actually, you know, you will continue to move into the strategic box, which means that my meetings with you may be every month, depending on what's happening at the time. And exactly as I say, is how does that end up changing their position? What is it that you want to do? Is it improving or declining? What's the plan around that strategy and what that relationship is? Relationship is very important for both sides. And that is basically all I have to say on that.
Superb. Thank you very much, Danny. You mentioned a couple of resources during your conversation. So one is the Audit Defence Checklist. This is a free article on the ITAM Review. If you just Google ITAM Review Audit Defence Checklist, and I'll put the link to this in the article that accompanies this video, excuse me, but Google that and you'll find nice to have, negotiable or non-negotiable terms. We published it back in February, very kindly from a gentleman called Chris Moffat, and it's a superb list of negotiation points to think about. And the other resource I want to point you towards to help with this is the Campaign for Clear Licensing's Code of Conduct. So that says, Mr. Vendor, if you're going to come in, here's a set of behaviour that I want you to adhere to that's positive and reasonable to expect. So just a couple of extra resources. Danny, that's really useful, really superb. Thank you. How can people get hold of you that want to speak to you? Is LinkedIn the best way, or what's the best way to get hold of you?
So yeah, link into me to LinkedIn. Send me an email. Of course, send me an email at my Argos email address if you want. I do have a number of people that contact me directly just to ping ideas off and have conversations over. I'm always happy to speak to anyone. Like I said, I think in this business we need to be more open and more communicative to each and every one of us, and I'm quite happy to promote that and give my time up to people in order to help them on this journey.
Perfect. You're a gentleman and a scholar. Thank you for sharing your ideas, and we'll call that a wrap. Thank you very much for your time.